The U.S. is effectively trying to exercise all options short of military to pressure North Korea. How much more room do they have?
Well, they have some room because both China and Russia aren't going to cooperate. And if they succeed in getting them to cooperate, then they will shut down a big piece of North Korea's most vital trade. It's trade with China in petroleum, which in the past the Chinese have done. The Chinese have said they have to maintain the pipeline, and that's had an effect. Don't know that it'll have a perfect effect, but it has. And at this stage, it doesn't look like we're going to get Chinese and Russian cooperation. Both of them pushed back pretty hard in their UN speeches over the day.
They have pushed back pretty hard, Thomas. You're exactly right. And what's also hard is the language that continues to be thrown about between the U.S. and North Korea. North Korea just coming out now through their state news agency calling Donald Trump deranged and saying he will pay dearly for his threats. And we know President Trump reiterating Rocket Man, describing Kim Jong-un. Outside of this name calling, though, if President Trump can't get Russia and particularly China to do much of anything, at what point are military options a serious option?
It's a difficult question to answer, but it is also a difficult step to take, and that's why we see those two difficulties combined. Were we to use military options short of responding to North Korean military options, I'm not sure we'd have a great deal of support around the world. And I'm pretty sure, in fact, that we would be off on a track that would be hard to stop. And what bothers me the most is that there is no diplomatic counterpart going on with this increasing pressure. So it's as if, in fact, you welded the valve shut on a pressure cooker, put water in it, and turned up the heat and expected everything to come out exactly the way you wanted. So it takes diplomacy to shape the answer. And I think that there's a failure so far to put forward diplomacy to help shape that answer. I'd feel more comfortable because I think pressure can help, but I think it can only help if, in fact, it's aimed and directed.
Well, Thomas, previously when we've seen North Korea really ramping up its military program or its missile program, it's in a way been a cry for help for food or fuel aid. Is this what we're seeing here? And is this why China and Russia are saying it's time to sit down and talk?
I don't know. And I think it would be interesting to explore that because once there is a cry for aid, you have some leverage in seeking the ends you want. And it's very clear that we have an opportunity, both China and North Korea, in not so oblique ways, have said they're prepared to stop ballistic missile testing and nuclear weapons testing. What they want in return is an end to the exercises with South Korea, which from our perspective is a high price. But I think that something going here between these particular sides where, in fact, if there is an interest in food or there's an interest in something else, we are in a position to ask for that kind of an offer that's been put on the table. So I'd like to see the diplomacy a little more robust, and I don't want to see us have to heighten the pressure to the point where we have no more options, because we're going to need options if we're going to negotiate an outcome here. And if we exhaust all the pressure now getting to the table, it is not a wise way to proceed.
Well, in previous situations, we've seen a lot of pressure applied and a lot of sanctions piled up as well, and they haven't really worked in the past. The situation now is worse than it's ever been. Why is there an expectation that sanctions are going to make any difference this time?
I think there's not an expectation that sanctions are necessarily going to make a difference. I think there is an expectation that escalating pressure can make a difference. As I keep telling you, though, without some kind of contact and some kind of process going to turn that pressure into a positive result, we're merely playing games of chicken with the North Koreans.
Thomas, I want to turn to Iran, though, because we, certainly have been, that has been in the news within the last 24 hours, and there's a lot of questions as to whether the U.S., or rather President Trump, is going to decertify the Iranian nuclear agreement. Tell me what you think the result is going to be. Is it really going to be isolation of Iran or isolation of the U.S.?
Well, I think if we decertify, there are two possible options. Some of that will not be controlled by the U.S., but by Iran and the rest of the world. One is if we decertify, and that leads to an end to the waiving of sanctions, we will have violated the agreement, not Iran. That's pretty clear. The second is that if the agreement is violated, they're no longer bound. So they can start the centrifuges spinning. They can up their enrichment. They got to 20%. They can go higher if they want. And that's one tactic, and that's one tactic the Iranians have threatened. There is another tactic, however, to keep the deal with the other parties and use that to isolate the United States and its influence, both on the future of Iran and the arrangements with Iran, but also to isolate the United States in terms of its influence in the region and perhaps beyond. And that may be, in the long run, more unhappy for the U.S. Than the centrifuges spinning. But both of them seem to me to be dumb ideas. We can keep the deal in place, and we can build on that deal. And there's a little bit of a hint out of the news this morning, particularly from Secretary Tillerman, that he'd rather keep the deal in place and use that as the basis for dealing with such questions as the time limits in the deal, right, which are seen to be shortening and seem to be threatening. And I think that that makes a lot of sense. And a couple of us have already put ideas like that on the table for the professionals to look at.
Thomas, I mean, we heard President Trump, though, say the other day or yesterday that he has made his decision, though, on Iran. Do you believe he's actually made his decision? And what do you think is happening right now in order to ensure, as you mentioned, comments from Tillerson sound as if it's better to stay within than to leave the accord. What do you think can be happening around President Trump to try to convince him that staying in is actually good for the United States?
Betty Lou, I've learned you can't second guess the president on these things. He marches to his own drummer. But we have seen some occasions recently where a number of people, we call them the axis of adults, General Mattis, Secretary Tillerson, General Kelly, General McMaster, former Senator Coates. And I think that's something that we should push for. I think that's something that makes a lot of sense. French President Macron suggested that. A number of Europeans are pushing for it. It is a sensible way forward. Right. It doesn't throw out, put it this way, the baby with the bathwater, but in fact leaves the door open, right, so the baby hopefully can get a shower down the road.